Hello and welcome to revision tips for CIPS Level 3, Advanced Certificate in Procurement and Supply Operations. This is Module 1, Procurement and Supply Environments, and it's Learning Outcome 3, which is to know the external environment and its impact on procurement and supply. So stuff goes on externally, in the external environment that we can't necessarily control. But one thing we should be doing is to keep an eye on what's going on, keep abreast of this information. And a method we can use for assessing the impact is firstly the environmental scanning. This is about going around and looking at information and collecting data on our supply markets. So for example, we might want to look at who our major competitors are and who do they buy from in the supply markets. What are the trends in our supply markets? Are things going up or down or staying the same? Or are people moving from buying a certain product to something new? And then you do a pen portrait of your key suppliers, and you should include major news stories around things like changes in senior management and any key accounts that those key suppliers might have won. The second one is to do a SWOT, which I'll talk about in a second, Steepled and Porter's forces. So a SWOT analysis. This can be used to evaluate the data you've gathered from environmental scanning. Your strengths and weaknesses are internal, your opportunities and threats are external. You can SWOT pretty much anything. Businesses use this as a sort of high-level strategic tool to look at how they're doing as a business, but you can SWOT a category, you can SWOT a contract, you can SWOT a product to understand what are the strengths and weaknesses, what's going well, what's not going well, but also what the opportunities and threats are in the external marketplace. And if you're honest with this, what you're able to do is identify your weaknesses and threats and convert them into opportunities. Do something about it. We're now going to look at Steepled. I mean, in the front of the book, it talks about Steepled, but it also refers to Pestle. Pestle is a shorter version of Steepled, but I'm going to use Steepled today because it's the most comprehensive version in Level 3. Steepled is a way of identifying factors that impact your markets. We'll cover them in a bit more detail as we go through the chapters. This is just an introduction. So firstly, social. This looks at things like income and labour, education attainments, living conditions, health factors, and attitudes towards work and leisure. From a technological point of view, you want to be aware of any sort of emerging technology and things that are available, but also what's happening to the technology you're using. Is it becoming out of date? But it'll also cover the attitudes towards technology. Some people are, willing and able to adopt new technology, others are not. From an economic point of view, we look at things like national, regional and international economies, taxation, inflation, and what's going on with major and minor industries. Environmental looks at natural resources and local plant or wildlife. The attitudes towards sustainability, waste management and recycling, but also looking at ecological change and balance. Politically, this will look at government structures and stability, party political dynamics, public policies and our international agreements. From a legal point of view, it will look at compliance with regulating bodies, laws relating to contracts and employment, and union dynamics and issues. From an ethical point of view, it looks at things like the needs and necessaries, reporting and procedures, the impacts of reputation on business's success, and confidentiality. So things like slavery and things like that will appear in the ethics. And then demographics looks at the total population makeup, the ethnic diversity and age group dynamics, as well as gender differences and population shifts. So Porter's 5 forces is the next model I want to share with you. This comes again from Michael Porter, the same gentleman that did the Porter's value chain. And it's used to analyse the structure and competitiveness of a market. It looks at competitive forces by looking at relative power and dependency in the supply chain. And there are 5 forces. Firstly, supplier power. Few suppliers compared to buyers who have very unique products or services. This is often referred to as a monopoly, where there's only one supplier, or one with a very, very big dominance. That would require high switching costs for us, and it's probably not even a close substitute available. You've then got the threat of substitutes at the bottom. This industry has high barriers to entry, and it's often referred to as a situation known as an oligopoly or a duopoly when there's 2 suppliers. So a good example of this would be Apple and Samsung, 2 very large branded companies with, again, high barriers to entry. It will cost a fortune to start to try and compete with these really large brands. They don't tend to compete on price, actually. They tend to compete on features. So they sway customers one way or the other based on the functionality of the product or service. At the top, you've got the threat of new entrants. There aren't massive barriers to entry here. There are some large players, but small independents can set up quite easily. The products on offer tend to be slightly different. So, for example, if you take coffee shops, there'll be different flavours and aromas in different coffee shops that would sway a customer to go from one to the other. And the one on the left, the power of the buyers, this is where you've got few buyers compared to suppliers. And the suppliers' products or services are quite standard, so you can't really, differentiate as you can with the threat of new entrants. But there's often low profitability from the buyers. And the fifth one in the middle is the rivalry. This is almost like a stress ball. You can squeeze it depending on how much rivalry that exists within the market. One thing that will impact on that is supply and demand. Let me start with some definitions first. Demand is the amount of a product or service that's demanded by the customer. Supply is the amount that's actually available to be supplied to those customers. And the law of demand states that demand for a product decreases as the price increases. Excess demand can be as a result of a price or a product falling below the cost to produce it. The law of supply states that supply of a product will increase with price. In addition, if there is excess supply available above demand, then the price is likely to go down. An excess supply could be as a result of a price of a product being set much higher than a buyer is willing to pay. The point at which the supply and demand curve meet is known as the equilibrium. This means there are no excess supply and no unsatisfied demand. In other words, the market clears. A nice idea, but rarely practical. Therefore, organisations need to understand the mechanics behind this in order to forecast accurately. Let's look at the example of seats on an aeroplane. Say an aeroplane has 300 seats. That's the physical supply that's available, but demand could be higher or lower than that. If the demand was 400, that red curve would move to the right. It would be higher up the supply curve, which means that it would cross at a higher point. Higher quantity equals higher price. But if less than 300 people wanted to fly on that flight, that blue curve would move to the red curve would move to the left. It would be underneath where it is now, which would mean it would cross the blue line at a lower point. Lower quantity equals lower price. Now, linked to supply and demand are things like market capabilities, supply risks, and other market factors. Now, movements can occur in both demand and supply. Price can cause a movement in the quantity sold, whereas shifts can occur in both supply and demand. So, for example, on a rainy day, demand for umbrellas will increase, but the price remains the same. On a hot day, Demand for ice cream will go up, but the price will stay the same. And then the market factors look at capabilities, the number of available suppliers that can actually do what you want them to do, which links nicely to Porter's 5 forces. And it can depend on process improvements, technology, as well as financial factors, but also on risk. So you need to consider your supply chain risks because the higher the risk, the higher the price is likely to be. The lower the risk, the lower the price. So putting this all together, this table summarises the structure of a supply market and the implications for how prices are set. So in your perfect competition, this is where you've got the power of the buyers, many suppliers with identical products and no barriers to entry. There is zero supplier power and price will be determined using supply and demand. Monopolistic competition is the top of your Porter's forces, threat of new entrants. There are lots of suppliers again, but the products are slightly different. Not big barriers to entry, low power, and they compete based on this supply and demand, but also the differentiation. Oligopoly is on the bottom of your Porter's forces model. It's the threat of substitutes, typically between 2 and 10 suppliers. The products are different. There's substantial scale and scope in terms of barriers to entry. They're normally highly technical organisations with lots of infrastructure, which presents them with medium to high power. And monopolies, the one on the right-hand side, power of suppliers, there's only one with no close substitute and substantial barriers to entry, meaning that they've got maximum supplier power. Now we're going to look at the product life cycle. This is a marketing concept that takes the view that products go through a number of stages from the point of which they're introduced to the point from which they're withdrawn. Think about cassette tapes. When was the last time you saw one of those? What about an iPod Nano? So products will go through the life cycle, but be replaced by other things that do the same job. So once was vinyl records was replaced by cassettes, cassettes was replaced by CDs, CDs were replaced by MP3s, and now we stream pretty much everything. Although occasionally something will make a comeback. I know that vinyl records have made a comeback, for example. But if we look through these stages, in the introductory phase, the product and service is first launched, and sales are generally quite slow. When they hit the growth phase, sales increase rapidly. Eventually, they'll hit maturity, which is where the market reaches its saturation point, and decline, where the product becomes out of date and replaced by something new. Linked to this is the adoption life cycle. As I said earlier, not everyone's willing to adopt technology at the same pace. So the adoption life cycle looks at the rate at which products will go through the product life cycle, and it depends on the adoption life cycle. So essentially, you've got these group of people that are innovators that can't wait. They have to have everything first. The early adopters don't fall far behind them, but they're probably paying quite high prices for products because they're impatient. Early majority, middle majority or late majority, this is where you're sort of hitting your maturity. And then finally to the laggards, our parents or grandparents, who are always the last people to adopt any form of new technology. But the strategy an organisation can take at the introductory phase can go one of two ways. There's a price skimming strategy and a price penetration strategy. Price skimming sets the price high in the introductory phase, aiming to capture a very small percentage of the market. It capitalises on the rich, famous and impatient people, and the seller gets a really quick return on their investment. The price then reduces over time and then it hits the growth phase. Now, penetration works the other way. I would say price skimming is used for products that are very well established in the market. Penetration would be used for products that are new and you want to convince somebody to buy them. So you end up coming in with a really low price introductory phase, aiming to capture quite a high percentage of the market really quickly. And you're capitalising on bargain hunters who love a deal. Seller gets a very slow and steady return on investment, but also sales will still grow in the maturity stage and growth stage because now their product is becoming more established. So looking at the economic factors of Steepled, we're going to look at both the macro and microeconomic factors. The difference between the two is that the macroeconomy is the whole country rather than a specific sector, and the microeconomy looks at factors that affect individuals and businesses and the economic decisions that they make. So macro, interest rates, inflation, exchange rates, and also the level of economic activity, which is measured using GDP and GNP. Micro looks at customers, employees, competitors, media, shareholders and suppliers, which to some extent you can control, but it's really hard to control the ones on the left-hand side. But looking more deeply onto that left-hand side, the macroeconomics, things that affect it are firstly interest rates, and interest rates will change due to the supply and demand for money changing over time. Exchange rate at the bottom can affect any organisation that imports or exports their goods and services. But the one in the middle, inflation, has a sustained increase over time, can go three ways. So we've seen from supply and demand that demand can pull a price up. If demand exceeds supply, the price goes up. It could be a cost push reason. So costs have risen, national minimum wage has gone up, material costs have risen, cost has pushed up the price of an item. But the last reason for inflation is for overexpansion of money. When companies lend money, businesses lend money to individuals, they're going to spend it. And that leads to inflation. And then the last two things on the macro is GDP and GNP. GDP stands for gross domestic product, and it measures the total value of the output of a business and people in a country in a year. And when I last looked at this, it said GDP was about $2.6 trillion, which is a lot of money. But then GNP will neutralize that. It will take the total value of output of business in the country, no matter where they are in the world, and it converts it into something known as PPP, which is purchasing power parity. So you can measure, European countries with Americas and Asia's and just see what your PPP is. In terms of microeconomics, your customers determine the need for a product or service. Your employees need to have the appropriate level of training, skills, and be motivated. Having competitors in your market is a sign of a healthy market, as long as they don't go into a price war. The media can influence potential customers' views on a product, either good or bad. And shareholders can vote in AGMs. They get to say how much profit stays in the business and how much they take. And suppliers' influence depends on the power they have in the market. Think back to Porter's 5 forces. From a political point of view, we need to consider the political criteria. And what we initially think about is political instability. But we should also think about democracy, which is the most common political ideology across the world, where government in a democracy receives their power directly from the public by means of a voting system. And it's interesting to understand the level of democracy in a country you may be considering trading with. Countries are split into 3 categories. Firstly, free countries. These are the green ones. They say that people's political freedoms are respected and enforced, and media has complete freedom of speech. The yellows are the partly frees. These countries have free and fair elections, and they honour people's civil liberties, but level of participation is low, and the media doesn't have complete freedom of speech. And the purple ones are not free at all. These countries are in an absolute dictatorship, or certainly were in 2018 when this map was drawn. So that's your political criteria. We're now going to look at the legal criteria and legislation. There are 5 main areas that procurement need to be aware of when sourcing from suppliers, 5 main areas of law. The first one is corporate law. This governs the formation of companies. If you think back to chapter 1, learning outcome 1, we talked about incorporated companies. So corporate law will govern the formation of incorporated companies. Business law looks at the formation of contracts. Depending on where you are in the world, there may be different legalities for a contract, but in the main, you need an offer acceptance, you need consideration, capacity, and intention, something we'll learn in later books. Finance law covers things like tax restrictions, imports and exports, but as well as corporation and personal tax. And if those taxes are high, then demand could be low because people have less disposable income. Employment law will cover health and safety, things like 2P, which stands for the transfer of undertakings for the protection of employees, as well as matters like non-discrimination. And finally, environmental law, looking at, waste disposal and the WE directive. Moving on to environmental and ethical criteria next. Environmental criteria will include things like natural risks. These are things like floods and hurricanes and earthquakes and fires, which can damage an organisation's assets or interrupt the supply chain. Waste emissions need to be disposed of in a way that's safe and efficient, or recycled in compliance with environmental laws. Pollution has an impact on the environment, and organisations should aim to reduce this impact where possible. Procurement needs to monitor suppliers' emissions closely to ensure they're in line with corporate social responsibility policies. And efficiency for energy. Organisations need to aim to maximise energy efficiency. The ethical criteria will look at ethical codes, employment rights, community benefits, and working conditions and standards. Finally, we'll look at the implications of social criteria that affects procurement. The social criteria determines the demand for the organisation's products or services, so procurement needs to be aware of these. These are things like changing societal preferences, tastes and fashions, demographics, labour and working conditions, fair trade standards, where fair trade creates opportunities for disadvantaged producers, as well as corporate social responsibility. And corporate social responsibility is about understanding the impact an organisation has on the wider world and how that impact can be made positive. There are 5 groups that can be impacted by an organisation. Firstly, your customers. So be open and honest, write information in plain language, don't hide things in the small print. Your suppliers. Select suppliers who concentrate on employment, health and safety, and environmental practices. Employees. Involve them in working in the local community. And for the local community, do things that bring a wide range of benefits to them. And finally, environment. Reduce packaging and waste and increase your recycling. So what do you think the benefits are of doing all these things? Critics would say it costs you more money, so why bother? But actually, what we find is that if an organisation adopts a corporate social responsibility policy, they have a far more motivated workforce who become more efficient. They have a better public image, so good PR as a result, which clearly will bring customers in the door. That will then improve the organisation's share price, which in turn will attract investment, providing an opportunity for that organisation to grow. Thanks for watching.